Under the glittering lights of a downtown restaurant, Grace Miller carried a tray that felt heavier than usual. Not because of the wine glasses, but because of the laughter. Sharp, cruel laughter that came from a table full of wealthy executives who looked at her like she wasn't a person, just part of the decor. When one of them, his watch worth more than her yearly rent, accidentally spilled a glass of Coke down her white shirt, the sound of his mock apology burned worse than the sticky liquid itself. The room went silent for a beat, then erupted in laughter. Grace didn't cry, she didn't shout. She just picked up the shattered glass with trembling hands, her face calm while her heart fractured. What no one in that room knew was that her husband, Daniel Moretti, wasn't just a quiet construction entrepreneur. Behind his calm eyes and perfect suits lay a man who built empires out of silence and could crush them the same way. When he saw the video of his wife being humiliated, something inside him shifted. He didn't rage or threaten. He simply closed his laptop, called 3 people, and by the next morning the stock value of Marlowe Enterprises, the company those men represented, had begun to fall. Grace had no idea that her humiliation had set off a silent storm, one that would not spill blood, but would change everything about who she thought her husband was, and what kind of justice love could bring. The night Grace Miller realized her husband wasn't just a contractor with city permits and political friends, but something else entirely. It wasn't because of a gun on the table or a threat in a dark alley, like in cheap mob movies. It was because of silence. A kind of coordinated, intentional silence that spread through an entire corporate tower like spilled ink. That day had started like any other in a building where people like Grace didn't usually belong. Marlowe International occupied 42 polished floors of mirrored glass, steel, and entitlement. The kind of company that donated to charity in the morning and ruined families in the afternoon, smiling the whole way. 3 days earlier, in the middle of their glittering office cafeteria, a VP named Ethan Carter had accidentally poured a full glass of soda over Grace's blouse just to laugh about it in front of his friends. She'd stood there choking on humiliation while everyone stared, and no one did a damn thing to stop it, except Daniel, who'd appeared out of nowhere, placed his suit jacket on her shoulders like she was royalty instead of a restaurant girl who'd married upward, and told Ethan in a calm, almost measured voice, "You're going to regret that." Ethan had laughed, because men like Ethan thought consequences were for other people. Grace hadn't laughed because she'd seen Daniel's eyes. She knew that tone. That tone meant something had already started. She just didn't know what. She would. She'd learn fast. On Monday morning, Marlowe International woke up to a security lockdown that no one had authorized. Badge access failed for half of the C-suite, including Ethan. Keycard servers were under audit. Compliance had triggered a temporary freeze. Legal was verifying operational exposure. All those phrases meant the same thing in corporate language. Someone bigger than you just reached into your veins and squeezed. People in fitted suits who used to strut past reception were suddenly being told, "You'll need to wait right here, sir," like they were delivery drivers. Phones lit up. People started whispering. Faces changed. Grace didn't know any of that at first. She was home, in an oversized t-shirt, sitting at the kitchen island with a mug of coffee and a knot of dread under her ribs, feeling like she had swallowed last night's tension, and it hadn't dissolved yet. She couldn't stop replaying what had happened, not even the soda or the laughter. She could live with being mocked. She'd lived with worse. But the way Daniel had looked at Ethan afterward, he hadn't yelled, he hadn't postured. He had just leaned in like he was giving Ethan a private blessing and said, 3 days, use them. She knew her husband. She knew what it meant when he gave a countdown. She had married a man who people lowered their voices around without knowing why. She had married a man who never said please twice. So when her phone buzzed that morning, and it was Lila, her friend from before Daniel, before the ring, before the nicer apartment, when she and Lila split diner tips and paid rent in cash. The first words out of Lila's mouth were, "Grace, what did your husband do?" Her blood went cold. "What?" "Marlo is on fire," Lila whispered so fast the words came out like a single breath. "I'm not supposed to be on this floor, but I came up anyway because people are losing their minds. There are federal auditors in conference room B, like actual federal—" "Wait, federal auditors?" Grace said, sitting up. Her heart kicked. "Why?" "Because somebody," Lila said, lowering her voice even more, "dropped a 4-inch binder on the table at 8:12 a.m. with copies of internal emails, payout schedules, bribe chains, and a breakdown of 3 shell companies tied to Marlo's infrastructure development contracts. I just watched our general counsel almost faint. Do you understand? Do you understand what I'm saying? This is RICO-level stuff." Grace swallowed. Slowly. Very slowly. Who gave them that? She already knew. She didn't want to know. "No one knows," Lila whispered. "Security didn't log them in. Cameras between sub-lobby and 31 glitched for like 7 minutes. You want to guess how often that happens here? Never. Someone with access did this. Someone untouchable. Untouchable." Grace stared at the marble countertop, at the fruit bowl she'd filled an hour ago like a normal wife, like a normal morning, like normal existed in her zip code. Her hands were steady. Her stomach wasn't. "Lila," she said quietly, "is Ethan there?" The tiny pause that followed said everything. Finally, Lila exhaled. "Ethan's office is empty. His computer is gone. His nameplate is down. HR says he's transitioning out of the company effective immediately." You've worked enough admin jobs to know what effective immediately really means. They killed him on paper. He's done. Grace's throat felt tight. "And Marlo?" "Daniel Marlo is in a meeting with people who look like they eat CEOs for breakfast," Lila said. "And he's sweating. I've never seen him sweat. He's—" "Grace!" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They're saying the city's forcing Marlo to transfer 20% ownership in Midtown Harbor Logistics to a community development trust and restructuring payouts to labor contracts and setting up a fund for workers. This is like a movie, babe." Grace didn't answer. Couldn't. Her heart was too loud in her ears. Her husband had told Ethan, "You're going to regret that." And now a man with a $4,000 watch and a "Do you know who my father golfs with?" attitude had been erased from a company built on arrogance. Her husband had stood in front of a table full of men who thought they owned this city and had set a timer. And now entire asset portfolios were moving hands, and lawyers were pretending to cooperate instead of choking on their own air. That wasn't anger. That wasn't ego. That was control. That was strategy. That was power built on pressure points. That was Daniel. "Grace?" Lila said softly. "You still there?" "Yeah," Grace whispered. "I'm here. I'm serious," Lila breathed. "Tell him thank you. For what he did. Whatever he did. Do you get what 20% of Midtown Harbor is worth? Do you get what that means? We're talking millions. And it's not going to them. It's going to us. To unions. To families. People are calling it reparations. Marlo's PR is already spinning it like it was voluntary. But we all heard him screaming 10 minutes ago. This wasn't voluntary." Grace closed her eyes. Daniel hadn't touched Ethan. Daniel hadn't punched anybody. Daniel hadn't walked in with a gun. He had walked in with leverage, with receipts, with every ugly little secret documented and gift-wrapped in a way the government couldn't ignore. He hadn't needed to threaten to burn it down. He had simply shown them the fire already existed and asked how fast they wanted the city to see the flames. Lila kept talking, but Grace barely heard her. Her mind had already walked back through the last 3 years, replaying every moment that hadn't made sense before. How Daniel always knew which projects in the city were real, and which were just paper-shuffling scams. How he could get a building inspector to show up early when a landlord refused to fix heat for a family in December. How he once told a councilman, "You're going to vote the way you said you were going to vote, not the way you were paid to vote." And the councilman had actually done it. How contractors who tried to skip safety rails on job sites that hired ex-cons suddenly found themselves audited into compliance within days. She had always told herself Daniel just knew people, that he worked in construction and logistics, which was true, technically. She knew he handled permits, materials, contracts, labor. She knew he spent a lot of time on the phone late, talking in that calm, low voice he used when something serious was happening. She knew sometimes men came to the diner who weren't from her side of town and treated her with a strange mix of fear and politeness when they realized who she was. She had told herself a story, because she needed to believe her marriage fit inside something normal. But the truth wasn't asking permission anymore. It was in her kitchen. It was in her hands. And when the front door opened and Daniel walked in, she felt it in the air before he even spoke. He didn't look like a man who had just torn out the throat of a corporation and made them thank him for not doing worse. He looked like a man who had just finished taking out the trash. Calm, composed. Shirt sleeves rolled to his forearms, tie in his pocket. No swagger, no adrenaline shake, just quiet, efficient, done. "Hey," he said softly, like he was coming home from a normal job. "You eat?" "No," Grace said. "I wasn't hungry." "You should eat." He dropped his keys in the bowl and leaned down to kiss her forehead. And it was so normal, so routine, it almost broke her. She grabbed his wrist. "What did you do?" He didn't lie. That was one thing about Daniel. He never lied to her. Sometimes he didn't answer. Sometimes he changed the subject. Sometimes he waited until later. But he didn't lie. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze moving over her face like he was taking inventory of what she already understood. Finally, he exhaled. "I made sure they remembered what respect costs." Her mouth went dry. "Daniel." He sat across from her, forearms on the table, hands folded. His knuckles were unmarked, his cuffs were clean. His voice when he spoke was steady, but there was something under it. A core of heat she could feel like a pulse. "They touched you," he said quietly. "They humiliated you in public. They laughed. They treated you like you were disposable, so they could feel bigger than you. They thought they could spit on you and walk away because no one would make them pay." "I didn't need revenge," she whispered. "Yes," he said. "You did." She shook her head. "Daniel, this is different. This isn't some manager at a plumbing supply yard not paying his guys overtime. This is the same thing," he cut in, "just wearing nicer shoes." She stared at him. He didn't blink. "You told Ethan," she whispered. "You're going to regret that." "Yes." "He's gone." Daniel didn't smile. "No," he said. "He's not gone. Gone implies I erased him. I didn't erase him. I rearranged him. There's a difference." She swallowed. "Explain it to me." "He'll never touch you again," Daniel said simply. "He'll never touch anybody like you again. He'll never work in this city or any city that does business with this one. His name is now a cautionary tale at every bar where mid-level executives gather to congratulate each other for being important. And every time someone says the words, 'What happened to Ethan?' someone else will answer, 'He disrespected the wrong woman.' That's the story now. That's what lives forever. Not him. The consequence." Grace felt her heartbeat in her throat. "And Marlowe?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Marlowe," he said, almost conversational, "is going to be very busy pretending to be generous. He's going to smile in front of cameras you'll never see. He's going to talk about community responsibility, which he does not believe in and has never practiced. He's going to write big checks and call it charity when it's really restitution. And he's going to do all of that with his lawyers bleeding because the alternative is prison. And Grace? He met her eyes. He knows who put him in that chair. He knows who made him sit. It would have been easier if he'd yelled, if he'd pounded his fist and said, "No one hurts my wife." That would have been cartoon powerful, easy to digest, easy to forgive. But this wasn't anger. This was governance. Daniel hadn't just defended her. He had rewritten the balance of who was allowed to humiliate people like her in public. He had changed the rules. That realization scared her more than any gun ever could. "Who are you?" she whispered, because it wasn't a joke anymore. She wasn't teasing him in the kitchen at midnight. She wasn't saying it with a smile. She was asking for real because she needed to know if she was sleeping next to a storm. He was quiet for a long beat, then another. Then finally, he said, "You already know." It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't mystery. It was truth. She did know. She'd always known, just not in words. She knew he was the kind of man people called before they called the police. She knew he could sit in a room with developers, union reps, city planners, and men who didn't put things in writing, and they all listened. She knew he went to funerals no one talked about. She knew he took care of families quietly, no press, no handshakes, just envelopes and respect. She knew he'd grown up in a neighborhood where cops drove through but didn't stop unless there were lights already flashing, and he'd climbed out of it not by pretending he was better than it, but by making sure it couldn't be stepped on anymore. She knew he had enemies who smiled at him in person and tried to chip at him in the dark. She knew. She just hadn't said it out loud. "I didn't touch him," Daniel said softly, like he could feel her fear and wanted to meet it. "I never laid a hand on him. I never threatened him physically. I don't do that unless I have to. What I did was tell the truth in places he didn't want truth spoken. That's all." She let out a shaky breath. "The federal people," she whispered. "Lila said there were federal auditors in their building." "There were," Daniel said. "And before you ask, no, I didn't call in a favor. I lit a flare where certain people couldn't pretend not to see it. They moved because if they didn't move, I'd make them look like they were covering for him. Everyone in that room chose the version of the story that saved themselves best. I just wrote the part they were allowed to pick from." He said it so simply that, for a second, she forgot how big it was, how dangerous, how precise. "Daniel," she whispered, "this is going to come back." "Absolutely," he said. Calm. Absolute. You don't pull threads like that and expect the fabric to smile. Marlowe will want revenge. He'll think about it. He'll talk about it to men who wear cologne that smells like money and violence. He'll plan. He'll posture. He'll convince himself he still has weight. He'll tell himself I embarrassed him, which I did. But then, Daniel said, leaning forward just a little, he'll remember there are lines, and he'll remember who draws them, and he'll stay on his side. She stared at him, and for the first time since that cafeteria, she stopped feeling like she was going to fall apart. Not because she wasn't scared. She was. She would be dumb not to be. But underneath the fear there was something steadier, something that felt, almost, like being held. "You did all of this," she said, "because of me." "No," he said immediately. "Not just because of you." Her stomach dropped. She didn't know why that hurt, but it did. He saw it. His voice softened. "Grace," he said, and her name in his mouth was always a touch. "Listen to me. I didn't do this because you're fragile and needed me to fight for you. I did this because you're mine, and nobody gets to treat what's mine like garbage. I did this because you walked into that building on my arm, and they thought they could spit on you to spit on me and still be invited to the table. I did this because I don't let men like that think they're untouchable. And I did this," he finished quietly, Because I want you to know that in my world, you never stand alone. Not for a second. Not ever again. Something inside her cracked open at that, not with fear, with relief. Pure, aching relief. Because yes, the humiliation had burned. Yes, the laughter had dug under her skin like glass. But the worst part hadn't been the soda or the mockery. The worst part had been feeling small again. Invisible again. Disposable again. The way she'd felt her whole life. Like certain people got to treat her like she didn't matter because the world said it was allowed. And now, somewhere in a mirrored tower, those same people were rewriting policy because of her. Because she wasn't nobody. Because she had a last name now that made people reconsider how loud they talked. Her throat tightened. "They're calling me a gold digger," she whispered, the words coming out before she could stop them. "Online. On those gossip pages. Somebody leaked that picture of you putting your jacket on me. There's a headline, 'Contractor's wife plays victim.' They're saying I staged it for attention." Daniel's jaw flexed. For a flash, something old and dangerous moved behind his eyes. Not for her. For whoever had said that. "Does that bother you?" he asked softly. She laughed, but it wasn't really a laugh. "Of course it bothers me. I grew up getting called cheap if I said no and trash if I said yes. People don't know me, but they think they do. I hate that." He nodded slowly. "Do you want me to make it stop?" Her heart stuttered. He didn't say how. He didn't offer details. He didn't threaten. He just asked the question like it was something he could pick up and put down. Power to him was a tool, not a fantasy. He could pull levers she couldn't even see. He was offering to pull one for her. This was her test, and she knew it. She sat with it. Thought about Lila's voice shaking, about the union guys getting paid what they were owed, about the quiet fund being built for workers' families who'd been bulldozed by budget realignment. She thought about sitting in that cafeteria, soaked in soda, surrounded by people who thought she was a joke, and how much she had wanted to disappear. She looked at him. "No," she said softly. He went still. "No?" She nodded. "If you shut them up, they'll just say you did it because I cried, and you fixed it for me, like I'm weak. Let them talk. Let them say I don't deserve you. Let them say I married up. Let them say I'm nothing. I'd rather they underestimate me." "That part," she said, and a small smile tugged at her mouth. "That part I can handle myself." Something flickered across his face then. Pride, yes, but also something warmer, something almost reverent. He leaned back, eyes on her like he was memorizing her all over again. "God, I love you," he said simply. No performance, no build-up, just that. And her chest went tight, because Daniel wasn't careless with those words. He didn't throw them out to calm her down. He used them like vows. "I love you too," she whispered. "Even though I'm pretty sure I married a war." He huffed, a low sound that might have been a laugh. "You didn't marry a war," he said. "You married the man who ends them." Later, alone, after he'd gone to take a call that started with, "No, listen to me. You're not hearing what I'm saying," and dropped to a voice so quiet it made her skin prickle. Grace stood in the doorway of their bedroom and pressed her fingers to her temples. She should have been shaking. She should have been panicking. She should have been calling her sister, except she didn't have that anymore, and the ache of that was always there, waiting. Instead, she felt steady. Not because the danger wasn't real. It was, and she wasn't stupid, but because something in Daniel's world had shifted, and the shift had included her. She understood him a little better now. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't a savior. He was a line, a boundary, a promise enforced. People like Ethan built empires assuming nobody would ever tell them no and mean it. Daniel didn't raise his voice. Daniel didn't posture. Daniel handed them no on letterhead, and made it legally binding. She could live with that. She could love that. But she also understood something else. This wasn't over. Men like Marlowe didn't just take a loss and send flowers. Pride like his needed somewhere to hit back. And for men like that, the softest target was never the man who beat them. It was the person that man loved, which meant her, which meant she was in it now, whether she wanted to be or not. She wasn't naive about that. She felt it like weather pressure. She walked back to the kitchen, found Daniel still on the call, still calm, still coiled. He looked up when she entered, and in that tiny glance, she saw it. Worry. Not about himself. About her. She crossed the room, slid into his space, and pressed her palm to his chest, right over his heartbeat. He covered her hand with his without pausing his conversation. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They stood like that. Connected, steady, both of them fully aware that after what happened today, quiet wouldn't last. That retaliation would come disguised as paperwork or scandal or whispers, not always bullets. That someone, somewhere, would look at Grace Miller and think, "That's how we get to him." And she knew, standing there with his pulse under her palm, that she had a choice. Be afraid of that forever, or decide she would not break just because somebody else wanted her to. She chose, right there, in her own kitchen, with her husband telling very powerful people in a very calm voice what they were and were not going to do. She chose. She wasn't going to be the soft spot. She wasn't going to be the weak angle. She wasn't going to be leverage. She was going to be the woman they regretted underestimating. She lifted her chin and whispered, mostly to herself but loud enough for his eyes to flick to hers, "Okay, then let 'em come." His gaze warmed like fire catching. Later that night, when the city finally quieted and their block settled and the last siren faded into distance, Grace lay awake beside him, one hand resting against his ribs, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of his breath. She thought about the cafeteria. She thought about soda dripping down her neck while they laughed. She thought about how fast humiliation could turn into rage, and how rage, in the right hands, could turn into structure, into punishment, into change. She thought about the families who would eat this month because money that used to disappear into consulting fees was being rerouted into wages. She thought about a man like Ethan, who had never been told no by anyone who mattered, until her husband had made no a permanent stain on his name. And she thought, with a slow, fierce kind of clarity, this is what it means to matter. Not to be worshipped, not to be displayed like proof of someone's status, but to be protected, as if your dignity is worth a war. She had never, in her entire life, been protected like that. Not by life, not by luck, not by anybody. She wasn't sure she knew how to carry it yet, but she was going to learn. The next morning broke gray and soundless, the kind of quiet that sits heavy before a storm. Grace woke to the unfamiliar softness of silk sheets and the distant hum of security gates opening somewhere down the drive. For a heartbeat she didn't remember where she was. Then the scent of cedar and rain brought it all back. The night before. The gunfire. The blood that wasn't supposed to be there. She sat up fast, the sheet twisting around her, her pulse spiking until she saw the note on the nightstand. Downstairs. Kitchen. Daniel. No signature, no flourish. Just that. She dressed quickly, one of the oversized shirts Maria had left folded for her, and padded barefoot through hallways that seemed to stretch forever. The house was too quiet for something that big. In the kitchen she found him at the window, coffee in hand, staring toward the tree line. The bruises under his jaw had darkened overnight. The split on his knuckle was an ugly red against his skin. He didn't look like the kind of man who bled easily. "You didn't sleep," she said. "Neither did you." She wanted to ask how he knew, but realized he always knew. The man lived on observation. "I talked to Marco," he said finally. He's arranging transport this afternoon. I meant what I said. We're moving you. We, she repeated. Yes, me, you, Ethan. You'll like the new place. It's smaller, quieter. More cages, she murmured. He turned then, eyes catching hers. More walls, he corrected. And for now, walls keep you alive. Grace poured herself coffee, the kind of small rebellion that made her feel human again. And after that? When the walls stop them, what stops you? For the first time, something like exhaustion flickered behind his expression. You think I want this? He asked softly. The guns? The guards? The fear? You think I wake up hoping my son will learn to live like this? No, she said. But I think you stopped believing you deserve anything else. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. By noon, the SUV was waiting. Ethan pressed his face against the window glass as the car rolled down the long drive, waving at Maria until the gates closed behind them. Grace sat between him and Daniel, watching the city shrink in the rearview mirror. The skyline looked like memory, sharp at the edges but already fading. The new house was nothing like the mansion. It sat on a bluff outside the city, stone and steel instead of marble, the kind of place built to withstand siege rather than impress guests. Inside, everything smelled of wood smoke and salt air. Ethan ran room to room with the wonder of a child who'd never stayed anywhere long enough to call it home. Grace watched him, smiling before she realized Daniel was watching her. He's happy, she said. For now, Daniel replied. Can't that be enough? Not if I want it to last. He led her to his office, a narrow space lined with books and monitors. Maps of the city blinked with red points of light. Names scrolled across a screen. The hum of encrypted servers filled the air. You said you weren't in this world anymore, she whispered. I said I was changing it. He tapped the screen. These are the men who attacked last night. They work for Barrett, the one who took over after Marlowe went under. He's been circling for months trying to draw me back in. Why? Because I know too much. He turned, folding his arms. Barrett doesn't care about money. He cares about control. He thinks if he breaks me, he owns the city again. And me? Your leverage, Daniel said, blunt as a blade. The first thing any predator looks for is what their enemy loves most. Grace's stomach tightened. Then you should have left me where I was. Too late for that, he said. They already know your name. She swallowed. Then teach me how to stop being leverage. That made him pause. He studied her for a long time, as if weighing whether she meant it. Then, slowly, he nodded. Come back tonight, he said. After Ethan's asleep. That night, she did. The office was darker now, lit only by the glow of the monitors. He handed her a file. This is Barrett's network. People he pays, people who pay him. Politicians, cops, contractors. Read it. She flipped through the pages. You want me to memorize this? I want you to understand what power looks like when it stops pretending to be legal. Grace felt a chill crawl up her spine. And what happens when you have all this information? I decide who still deserves to be part of this city. You mean who lives and who doesn't? He met her gaze, unflinching. I mean who builds and who destroys. She closed the file. That's not justice, Daniel. That's judgment. They're the same thing when the courts are bought, he said quietly. For a moment they just stared at each other. The waitress who believed in fairness. The king who only trusted control. And somewhere between them, the truth pulsed. They needed each other because neither could survive their own extremes. The following week blurred into strange rhythms. Ethan's laughter in the mornings, security briefings at noon, coded phone calls after midnight. Grace cooked to fill the silences. Daniel worked to avoid them. Some nights he came to the kitchen late. Finding her still awake, sleeves rolled up, eyes shadowed. They'd talk then, not about danger or plans, but about small things. Her mother's pie recipe, his favorite book as a boy, how Ethan had refused to speak for months after his mother's death. The more he spoke, the more she saw how guilt had carved him hollow. On the seventh night, he found her on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sea. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Too quiet," she said. "Every time it's quiet, something bad follows." He sat beside her, the boards creaking under his weight. "I used to think that too. Then I realized quiet isn't the problem. It's what we fill it with." She looked at him, then at the bruises fading on his hands. "And what do you fill yours with?" "Regret," he said. "Plans? You." The wind caught her hair then, and for a moment they were close enough that the world seemed to narrow around the space between them. When he kissed her, it wasn't the desperate kind of kiss she remembered from frightened nights. It was slow, steady, the kind of kiss that said, "I'm still here." She kissed him back because for once she didn't feel like she was standing on someone else's ruins. They didn't talk about what it meant. They didn't need to. 2 days later, the illusion cracked. Grace was in the garden with Ethan when the sound of an approaching helicopter sent birds scattering from the trees. Within seconds, Daniel's men were running toward her. Marco's voice cut through the noise. "Get the kid inside!" Before she could ask, Daniel appeared, shouting over the roar. "Inside, Grace! Now!" But she froze when she saw the logo on the chopper's side, Marlowe Industries. Impossible. That company was gone. She'd watched the news herself, seen their empire crumble after Daniel's quiet retribution. The helicopter didn't land. It hovered, and something small dropped from its side. A box that hit the gravel drive with a dull thud. Daniel grabbed her arm, yanking her behind a stone pillar as the explosion ripped through the courtyard. Debris rained down. Ethan screamed. When the smoke cleared, Grace could taste metal. She turned and saw Daniel pushing himself up from the ground, blood seeping through a cut on his temple. He looked furious, not scared, not shaken, furious. "They found us," she whispered. He wiped the blood from his face. "No, they were told where to look." Her heart lurched. "You think someone—" "Yes." His eyes were cold now. "Someone inside." That night, the house was a fortress again. Guards tripled, cameras rewired, exits sealed. Grace tried to comfort Ethan, but the boy sensed more than she could hide. When Daniel came to her later, his face was drawn tight. "Barrett's not behind this," he said. "Marlowe's board never forgave me for what I did to them. They've been feeding Barrett's network." "Then what happens now?" "I remind them why they were afraid of me in the first place." He left before she could answer. Grace waited an hour, then 2, pacing the floor. She couldn't stay still. She found herself in the office again, staring at the map, at the blinking red points that marked every move Daniel tracked. One of them pulsed brighter than the others. A warehouse by the river. Active. She didn't know what that meant, but she knew he was there. She shouldn't have gone. She knew that even as she grabbed her coat. But love has a way of outrunning reason. By the time she reached the warehouse district, the sky had gone the color of lead. She spotted the black SUV first, parked half in shadow, engine still warm. She followed the sound, muffled shouting, the clatter of something heavy hitting metal. When she slipped inside, she saw him. Daniel stood in the middle of the room, a gun at his side, facing 3 men bound to chairs. They were the kind of men who thought money could erase evil. Grace recognized one of them, Mr. Claremont, Marlowe's former CFO, the man who had laughed the loudest that night in the restaurant. "Daniel?" she said, before she could stop herself. He turned fast, eyes wide. "What are you doing here?" "I came to stop you." He exhaled, something between relief and anger. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should you." He looked back at the men. "They killed my wife." Her breath caught. "What?" "They planted the bomb. Barrett ordered it." But they built it. They thought taking her would make me fold. It made me worse. The gun in his hand looked too easy, too natural. Grace stepped closer. And killing them will fix that? No, he said. But it will end it. She shook her head. No, Daniel, that's what they believe. You said you wanted Ethan to grow up in a world that doesn't run on fear. Then stop teaching him that fear wins. He stared at her for what felt like forever, his chest rising and falling like every breath hurt. Then, slowly, he lowered the gun. He turned to Marco, standing near the door. Take them to the police. Anonymous tip. Evidence included. Marco's eyebrows rose. Boss, do it. When they were gone, Daniel finally looked at Grace again. There was something raw in his face she'd never seen before. Not anger, not even sorrow. Surrender. You changed everything, he said. She shook her head. No, you just remembered who you were before the world told you what you had to be. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the river. He took her hand. It was the first time he'd ever let himself need anyone without apology. By sunrise, the warehouse district looked almost peaceful, like it hadn't just held the ugliest part of the city's soul inside it. But the choice Daniel had just made didn't stay in that room. It echoed. It moved. It bled into everything. By noon, 3 anonymous packages landed on 3 different desks. A federal prosecutor, an investigative journalist who'd tried for years to expose Marlowe's money trail, and a state regulator who'd been ignored until now. Each package came with files, internal transfers, offshore accounts, evidence of bribed inspections, falsified safety reports, and, most damning, explosive schematics connected to the car bomb that killed Daniel's wife. None of it mentioned Daniel by name. All of it mentioned Marlowe Industries and its circle. By 6 p.m., the story was everywhere. News vans parked outside marble driveways. Board members hid behind tinted glass. The men Grace had seen tied to chairs that morning were now being escorted in handcuffs through courthouse steps they used to walk past like they owned them. The internet called it justice. Grace didn't know what to call it yet. She only knew this. Nobody was laughing anymore. Not at the woman in the restaurant, not at the help, not at the Morettis. That night, back at the Bluff House, she stood in the doorway to the open living room and watched Daniel watch the news. The screen showed a swarm of reporters shouting questions over each other. Is it true the Moretti family is involved? Did you authorize violence to cover financial crimes? Are you aware your name is listed in sealed testimony? And then, her breath caught. Is it true you threatened the widow? Daniel muted the TV. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. They're going to spin it, he said. They have to. Men like that only understand power when they're holding it. When they lose it, they try to rewrite the ending. And you? She asked quietly. Are you rewriting too? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he rubbed a hand over his face, leaned back on the couch, and let out a breath that sounded like surrender and tension at once. I used to think justice meant control, he said. If I controlled what moved in this city, money, logistics, who had access to who, then maybe I could stop the bleeding. But I was wrong. Control is fragile. Fear is fragile. Stories are not. She blinked. Stories? The way people see you, he said. That's what lasts. Marlowe built his story on humiliation and untouchability. I just shattered both. Publicly. That matters more than any gun. Grace watched him in silence for a moment. Daniel, she said softly, they said something on the news. They said a lot of things. About a widow. They weren't talking about me. His eyes lifted to hers. Slowly. No, he said. They weren't. Then who? His throat worked. Her name was Sophia. The way he said it was quiet, reverent. We met before any of this was supposed to be my mess. I wasn't running anything then, just moving pieces for my father to keep things calm. She thought I was in construction and logistics. Technically, I was. I thought I could keep those two versions of me separate. I was wrong. He swallowed. When the bomb went off, she was on her way to meet me. Barrett called it collateral. He said it like it was weather. I told myself I'd never let that happen to anyone close to me again. That I'd never let anyone in close enough that they could get hurt because of me. And then you walked into my life and set my entire plan on fire. She could barely breathe. Daniel? You didn't run, he said. You didn't turn me in. You didn't sell me out. Even when people in suits with clean shoes and dead eyes leaned over your counter and tried to scare you into it. You cooked my son pancakes and made him feel safe in a world where safety is make-believe. And then you looked me in the eye and told me I was wrong to put a bullet in a man who'd earned 10 of them. He gave a rough half-laugh. Do you have any idea what that does to a person like me? I think, she said, voice barely above a whisper, it makes you remember you're still a person. He didn't smile this time. He just watched her, like she was something he hadn't decided if he deserved to touch. It makes me terrified, he said. It hit her low and electric. Of what? Of how fast I'd burn the whole world down if anyone came near you again. Her breath stuttered. Her pulse climbed, but she didn't flinch. That's not fear, she said softly. That's love. He went still, like she'd just put a gun to his chest. She held his gaze, steady, open, not running. You don't have to say it back, she added. I don't need you to. I just need you to hear it. I am in love with you, Daniel Moretti. I didn't plan for that. I didn't ask for that. But it's the truest thing I have. For a second he closed his eyes like it physically hurt him to feel anything that clean. Then he stood, crossed the room and cupped her face in both hands like she was something breakable and holy. I can't lose you, he whispered. Then don't, she whispered back. He kissed her, but this time it wasn't careful. This time it was the opposite of careful. It was all the held back, all the contained, everything he had refused to let himself want detonating at once. She rose into it like she'd always been meant to. When they finally broke apart, he leaned his forehead against hers. You're mine, he breathed. Say it. I'm yours, she whispered. Say it back. His mouth curved, but it wasn't a smile. It was possession turned to protection. And I, he said low like a vow, am yours. Upstairs, Ethan stirred. The moment softened, not in a way that ruined it, but in a way that grounded it, like the universe had just cleared its throat and reminded them what mattered first. Daniel exhaled and let his hands fall, but not entirely. One stayed at her waist, like a link. He needs stability, Daniel said quietly. He needs normal. He needs to stop watching doors. Grace nodded. Then we make normal, she said. Even if the rest of the world's on fire, we build him a pocket where it's not. He looked almost amused. Just like that? Just like that, she said. Breakfast at the same table, lights off at the same time. School work, bedtime stories, boring things, safe things. You want to scare the men who think power is chaos? Show them he grows up happy. Daniel let out a slow breath. You always think it's that simple. No, she said gently. I just think it's that worth it. The next days were a strange kind of domestic war. Security stayed high, but the house felt not softer exactly, but fuller. Less like a bunker, more like a home that happened to be fortified. Grace made breakfast every morning, and Ethan, who never used to sit through an entire meal, started waiting at the table before the plates even hit it. Daniel was there every morning, no excuses, no disappearances, no phone calls until after Ethan finished eating. The first time Ethan signed to him, not just to her, Daniel's jaw clenched and his eyes went glass bright. Ethan touched his father's wrist, shaped the sign slowly. Safe. Here. With you. Daniel swallowed hard and nodded. Then, hand unsteady, he signed back. Always. Grace had to look away because if she didn't, she was going to cry in a way that would break her open. Later, when Ethan was napping and the house felt quiet and warm instead of quiet and dangerous, Daniel leaned in the doorway and said, "You did that." "No," she said, shaking her head. "He did that. You did that. I just gave you words." "And sometimes," Daniel said, "words change everything." She didn't answer that out loud, but she felt it. Deep. The shift outside their walls followed. The men who once mocked Daniel for softening, who said he'd gone weak, started changing their tone when they realized what had actually happened. He hadn't gone soft. He'd gone focused. Scarier. He wasn't spraying threats in all directions anymore. He was drawing a circle and saying, "Cross this line and you disappear." Quietly, efficiently, legally where possible, ruthlessly where not. But with rules. His rules. No kid gets touched. No civilians get dragged in. No humiliation for sport. Word spread. The city changed shape around it. And through it all, Grace could feel something shifting in herself too. She had come from a world where surviving was the win. Make rent. Keep the lights on. Keep your head down. Do not owe anyone. Do not need anyone. Now, she was in rooms where men with cold eyes and expensive suits stopped talking when she walked in. Not because she scared them, but because Daniel's respect for her told them what line not to cross. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't background. She wasn't sweetheart or doll or, "Hey, coffee." She had weight. She had voice. At first it felt like wearing someone else's coat. Too heavy. Too tailored. Then, slowly, it felt like hers. One night, maybe 2 weeks after the warehouse, after the explosion, after the broadcast and the choice, she was out on the porch again. The ocean moved like muscle under moonlight. The air was cool enough to taste. Daniel stepped out beside her, carrying 2 glasses. Whiskey for him, tea for her. "You're thinking," he said. "You always get that stubborn line in your forehead when you're thinking about something you don't want to say because you're worried I'll take it like an attack." She huffed. "You memorized my forehead?" "I memorized everything," he said simply. "Tell me." She tightened the blanket around her shoulders. "I know you protected me because I got pulled into it," she said. "I know you're protecting Ethan because he's yours. But what happens when the city calms down? When Barrett is gone, when Marlowe's people are gone, when the papers stop calling you violent businessman and start calling you reformed public figure? What happens then? Do I get left behind?" His jaw flexed. "Grace, just answer." "Look at me," he said. She did. Slowly. He stepped closer, one hand coming up to touch her face. Fingers brushing her jaw like he was reminding himself she was real. "You don't walk behind me," he said quietly. "You don't walk in front of me. You walk with me. That's the only way this works. You understand?" Her throat went tight. She nodded. "Say it," he murmured. "I walk with you," she whispered. "Good," he breathed. Then softer. "Because I don't heal without you, Grace. I don't even know how." She laughed then, quiet and raw. "You're getting good at saying the thing instead of swallowing it." He smirked. "You're getting good at letting me." "Well," she said, tilting her head, "I am extremely talented." "Yeah," he said, eyes warm in a way that made her knees weak. "You are." She leaned into him, head against his shoulder, his arm settling around her like it belonged there. The ocean kept moving. The night kept breathing. And for a moment, a real moment, not borrowed, not fragile, not stolen between gunshots, everything felt steady. Not safe, maybe. Not yet. But steady. She let the quiet sit, Then she said, barely above a whisper, "We're not done, are we?" "With Barrett?" Daniel asked. "With everything." He didn't lie. He never lied to her. "No," he said. "We're not done. There are still people who think they can scare us back into the dark. There are still people who think breaking what's good is easier than building anything better." She nodded against him. "Okay," she said. "Then we keep building." He looked down at her, and there it was again. That flicker in his expression she'd once mistaken for danger, but now knew was something else entirely. "Aw. You're not afraid anymore," he said. She tilted her face up to his. "I was," she said. "But fear's loud. Love is louder." His mouth curved, slow and certain. "Then let them hear it." And that was the moment Grace Miller understood the truth of the life she'd stepped into. Not that she'd fallen for a dangerous man. Not that she'd been dragged into something ugly and forced to survive it. But that she had become part of the one thing every monster in that city actually feared. A home they couldn't break. A woman they couldn't buy. A child they couldn't touch. A man they couldn't bend. A future they couldn't rewrite. She hadn't just survived Daniel Moretti's world. She'd changed it. And she wasn't going anywhere. For weeks, peace became a fragile routine in the Moretti household, something that looked real enough to trick strangers, but never quite convinced the people living inside it. Grace woke each morning to sunlight spilling through linen curtains, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, and the soft rhythm of Ethan's footsteps as he practiced signing the alphabet at the table. On the surface, it was a life she'd once prayed for. Quiet, predictable, safe. But safety had an expiration date in Daniel's world, and she could feel it coming. Daniel had changed since the warehouse. He still carried power like gravity. Still moved through a room with that low, deliberate calm that made everyone else straighten their spine. But the sharpness in his eyes had dulled into something harder to name. Resignation, maybe. Or foresight. He spent more hours in his office now, the door closed, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and clipped. When Grace asked, he said it was cleanup. Final steps before he could let everything go. But she'd seen enough to know letting go was never simple for him. The city was bleeding, even if it didn't show it. Marlowe's empire had collapsed on live television. Barrett was rumored dead, and the few who had tried to fill the vacuum were either in hiding or pretending to be legitimate businessmen. For the first time in decades, the streets weren't ruled by fear. They were ruled by uncertainty. Daniel had done that. He'd burned out corruption so completely that people didn't know whether to thank him or fear him. But he'd also painted a target on his back that power and pride would never let stay empty. Grace saw it first in the little things. A car parked too long at the end of their drive. A stranger at the grocery store pretending to browse, but watching her reflection in the freezer door. A drone buzzing low one morning until Marco shot it out of the sky. Daniel told her not to worry. His men were handling it. But she noticed the way he stopped sleeping through the night again, how he'd get up at 3 a.m., check the perimeter cameras, pour a drink he never finished. Then the letter arrived. It was mid-afternoon, Ethan was napping, and Grace was folding laundry when Maria brought in an envelope marked with an official federal seal. "It came by courier," Maria said, frowning. "He signed for it already." Grace hesitated, then set the basket aside and carried the envelope to Daniel's office. He was at his desk, reading something on a tablet, but his hand froze when he saw what she held. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Maria said it was delivered. He took it from her, turning it over in his hand. His jaw tightened. "They're faster than I thought." "Who?" He sighed, rubbing his temple. "The Department of Justice. Or maybe the Treasury. Doesn't matter. Someone wants to make a name for themselves by cleaning up the last of the city's ghosts." "Meaning you," she said quietly. "Meaning anyone who reminds them how deep the rot went." He tore the letter open and read it quickly. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. "They're launching an inquiry," he said. "Subpoenas, financial audits. They want to know how Marlowe's assets disappeared and who profited." Grace's throat went dry. "Daniel, you didn't—" "No," he said sharply, then softer. "No, Grace. Not in the way they think. Every cent went where it should have, into rebuilding the neighborhoods Marlowe destroyed, into orphanages, hospitals, foundations. I made sure of that, but to them, money is never clean. It's just waiting to be traced. What happens if they find something they can twist?" He looked past her out the window at the water. "Then they'll come for me." She shook her head. "No, there has to be a way." "There is," he said. "I'll handle it." But she knew what handle it meant. It meant disappearances, manipulation, the same games he swore he'd left behind. That night, after Ethan was asleep, she confronted him. He was in the study again, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, documents spread across the desk. The light caught the edges of his face, casting half of him in shadow. "You're not fixing this with violence," she said. "I'm fixing this with leverage." "Leverage is just a slower kind of violence." He looked up then, eyes narrowing. "You think I want this? You think I enjoy cleaning blood off my own doorstep? I think you don't know any other way." He stood, closing the space between them. "You're wrong. I know exactly what I'm risking. I just don't have the luxury of hoping people like this play fair." She met his gaze, unwavering. "Then let me help." He hesitated. "Grace, I mean it. If this is about truth, not power, then let's prove it. Let's show them what you really did with that money." He almost smiled, weary but genuine. "You want to walk into a federal investigation with me?" "I want to walk beside you," she said simply. The silence that followed felt like a heartbeat stretched too long. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "But once you're in, you can't walk it back." "I don't plan to." That night, for the first time, he let her see the real files, the offshore accounts, the donation transfers, the shell companies repurposed into legitimate foundations. It was all there, buried under layers of coded transactions designed to protect the funds from being reclaimed by corrupt officials. Grace spent hours helping him organize, label, and annotate every record. She saw how precise he was, how deliberate, how much of his life had been spent building order out of chaos. "Why keep all this?" she asked once, her voice soft. He glanced at her. "Because power's not about fear, Grace. It's about memory. The city forgets what people like Marlowe do when there's no evidence left. I wanted a record. I wanted the truth to survive me." Something in her chest tightened at that. "You talk like you're already gone." "I'm just being realistic," he said. "People like me don't get clean endings." "Then we'll write one anyway," she said. He looked at her, then the way he had that first night in the diner. Like she was something impossible that he didn't quite believe could exist. 2 weeks later, they were summoned to testify. The federal courthouse loomed like a monolith over the city, all glass and steel, a temple built for judgment. The press swarmed the steps, shouting Daniel's name like it was a weapon. Grace walked beside him, chin lifted, fingers tight around his arm. He didn't flinch under the cameras. He didn't hide behind sunglasses or lawyers. He walked in like a man ready to face the ghosts he'd buried. Inside, the air smelled like paper and fear. The lead prosecutor, a woman named Alicia Vance, greeted them with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Moretti," she said, extending a hand she didn't expect him to take. "Thank you for coming voluntarily. It saves us a scene." "I don't do scenes," Daniel said. "Pity," she said, turning toward Grace. "And you must be Mrs. Miller." "Just Grace," she said. Alicia's gaze flicked between them. "You'll both have your chance to speak. I hope you understand what's at stake here." Grace nodded. "We do." For hours they sat under harsh lights, answering questions designed to twist truth into confession. Every dollar Daniel had moved, every contract he'd signed, every favor he'd called in, dissected, rephrased, weaponized. Grace could see the trap forming. The narrative that Daniel was no hero, that his philanthropy was just a front. When they showed a photo of her from years ago, taken at the diner the night of her humiliation, Grace realized what they were doing. They wanted to break her, not him. "Ms. Miller," Alicia said, her tone silky and cruel. "When you first met Mr. Moretti, were you aware of his reputation?" Grace kept her eyes steady. "I was aware of who he was as a father, but not as a criminal." Daniel's jaw tensed, but he didn't interrupt. Grace folded her hands. "You're asking the wrong question." Alicia arched a brow. "Am I?" "You're asking whether I knew what he'd done. You should be asking what he's done since." A murmur rippled through the room. Alicia's smile didn't waver. "And what would that be?" "He built schools," Grace said. "He rebuilt hospitals Marlowe's people destroyed. He hired workers no one else would hire because of their records, and he paid them fair. He didn't buy politicians. He bought time, for people who didn't have any." Alicia's voice softened to a sneer. "So you're saying love made you blind?" Grace smiled then, just barely. "No," she said. "Love made me see." Daniel's hand found hers under the table. Just a touch. Just enough. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel didn't defend himself with lawyers or excuses. He spoke about power, about corruption, about how a city breaks when good men do nothing. He admitted to the things that were true, and refused to confess to the ones that weren't. When it was over, the silence in the courtroom was heavier than any verdict. Alicia finally said, "You think this will make you a martyr?" Daniel stood. "No," he said. "Just a man trying to live long enough to raise his son without shame." The session ended without arrest, but the war outside had already started. The courthouse steps felt colder on the way out. The cameras had doubled, the shouting louder, the questions sharper. "Is it true you laundered Marlowe's assets? Are you cooperating with the FBI? Grace, do you know where the money went?" Flashbulbs snapped like gunfire. Daniel shielded her with one arm, guiding her through the chaos until the car door slammed behind them. The soundproof interior muffled the world, but Grace could still feel it pressing in. The city hungry for a story. Daniel stared out the window, face unreadable. "They'll never print the truth," he said finally. "They'll print the version that sells." "Then we give them something else to sell," she said. He turned to her. Curious, despite the exhaustion. "You trust the press now?" "No," she said. "But I trust stories. You said it yourself. Stories outlive fear. So tell one they can't twist." "You think people will believe it?" "They believed the worst of you without proof. Maybe they'll believe the best of you with it." He didn't answer, but the next morning he called in favors she didn't know existed. He met with an independent journalist, one of the few who hadn't been bought. For 2 days, they filmed in the house overlooking the sea. Daniel spoke plainly. No rehearsed answers. No spin. He showed receipts, plans, and most of all, results. Photos of rebuilt neighborhoods, schools and homes. Grace sat beside him, answering questions about the night in the restaurant. About the moment she realized the man she'd married wasn't just rebuilding buildings, but rebuilding people. When the documentary aired, it broke everything open. The city divided itself overnight. Half called him a savior, half called him a liar. But for the first time, the truth wasn't hidden in shadows. It was out there, living, breathing, undeniable. Then came the blowback. Marlowe's remaining allies resurfaced, angry and desperate. Anonymous threats turned into action. One night the alarm blared through the house. Marco burst into the bedroom. "Perimeter breach!" he shouted. Daniel was already moving, gun drawn, checking cameras. Grace grabbed Ethan, heart pounding, rushing to the safe room. The screens showed black-clad figures scaling the fence, cutting power lines. But before they could reach the house, floodlights exploded on. Daniel's men opened fire. The intruders scattered. When the dust settled, 4 men were dead. Grace sat on the floor of the safe room shaking, Ethan clinging to her. When Daniel finally came in, his shirt streaked with dirt and smoke, she saw something different in his face. Not fear, not fury. Finality. "It's done," he said quietly. "No more running." "What do you mean?" she whispered. "I mean they'll keep coming as long as I'm alive. The city can't move forward if I'm the story. It needs a villain to bury." "Don't," she said, standing, heart racing. "Don't you dare start talking like that." He cupped her face, thumb brushing her cheek. "Grace, I built this whole empire on silence and survival. You taught me something louder. But now it's your turn to build without me." "No," she said fiercely. "We build together." "Not this time," he said. "If I disappear, they stop hunting. They'll close the book. The investigation will die in a month. You and Ethan can live, really live." Tears blurred her vision. "You don't get to choose that for me." "I already did," he said, voice breaking for the first time she'd ever heard. "The moment I brought you into this world, I made you a target. This is how I fix it." She grabbed his wrist, shaking her head. "If you go, you'll make yourself the monster they want you to be. Stay. Let them see who you really are." His jaw clenched. "Grace." "Please," she whispered. "Don't leave him without a father. Don't leave me with a ghost." The silence between them stretched, trembling under the weight of everything they weren't saying. Then Daniel pulled her in, holding her like he was memorizing her heartbeat. "You make it sound easy to believe I deserve this," he murmured. "You do," she said. "For once in your life, believe it too." The next morning, Daniel didn't leave. Instead, he called a press conference. Against every warning from his lawyers, against every plea from his men, he walked onto a stage in front of the courthouse where the city had watched him walk out days before. Grace stood behind the curtain, Ethan's small hand in hers. Cameras flashed as he began to speak. "My name is Daniel Moretti," he said, voice steady. "I've been called many things. Businessman, criminal, husband, father. All of them are true. I did what I did because no one else would. I built systems to protect what this city abandoned. But I also broke laws. I broke people. And I can't ask for forgiveness if I'm not willing to face consequence." He paused, looking out at the sea of microphones. "Everything I took, I gave back. Every dollar I earned from darkness went to light. The evidence is public. But whether you believe it or not, that's not up to me. It's up to you." He glanced toward the curtain once, just once, and Grace felt it like a touch. This city doesn't need another myth. It needs truth. It needs to remember that justice isn't clean, but it's still worth fighting for. My wife taught me that. Reporters shouted questions, but he didn't stay. He turned, stepped down from the stage, and walked straight into the federal officers waiting at the edge of the crowd. No cuffs, no struggle. Just a quiet surrender. Grace held herself together until the door of the black car closed behind him. Then she knelt on the marble floor, Ethan's arms around her, and let the tears come. The months that followed blurred into strange normalcy. The investigation continued, but Daniel's cooperation and transparency changed its course. The narrative shifted, from criminal empire to redemption arc. The city began to rebuild for real this time, not just with money, but with purpose. Grace took over his foundation, renaming it the Sophia Project, after the woman whose loss had started it all. She poured her energy into it, traveling between neighborhoods Daniel had once controlled, speaking at schools, teaching kids sign language with Ethan by her side. She became the face of what he'd tried to create. Not power, but restoration. Daniel's sentencing came quietly, behind closed doors. 5 years in federal custody, reduced to 3 for cooperation and restitution. Grace visited him every month. The first time he looked thinner, older, but when she smiled, he smiled back, and it felt like the world was still repairable. "Ethan's reading now," she told him once, eyes bright. "He wants to show you next time." Daniel reached through the glass, palm flat. She pressed hers to his. "You keep building," he said. "Don't wait for me to come home to start." "I'm not waiting," she said. "I'm just keeping the seat warm." He laughed, low and soft. "God, I love you." "Say it again," she whispered. He did. And somehow in that sterile room, surrounded by guards and bulletproof glass, it sounded more like freedom than any sentence ever could. 3 years later, when he walked out, the city was different. The skyline gleamed, the streets were cleaner. And people whispered his name not with fear but with complicated respect. Grace was waiting by the car, hair wind-tossed, wearing the same shade of blue she'd worn the first night he saw her. Ethan was taller now, standing beside her, holding a sign that said, "Welcome home, Dad." Daniel stopped a few steps away, overcome by the sight. Grace stepped forward, eyes shining. "You kept your promise," she said. "So did you," he said. When Ethan ran to him, Daniel dropped to his knees and caught him mid-air, holding him like the world finally made sense again. Grace stood behind them, hand over her mouth, laughing through tears. That night, they drove back to the Sea House. The air smelled like salt and firewood, just like it used to. Daniel stood on the porch, staring out at the horizon. Grace joined him, sliding her hand into his. "You know," she said softly, "you missed 3 birthdays, 2 hurricanes, and about 40 burnt pancakes." "I'll make it up to you," he said. "You already did." He looked at her then, eyes softer than she'd ever seen. "Do you still believe in second chances?" She smiled. "No," she said. "I believe in earned ones." He laughed quietly, then leaned down, kissing her the way men kiss when they've run out of excuses. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain again, like the night everything had started. Inside, Ethan's laughter echoed through the halls. Grace pulled back just enough to look at him. "So what now?" He thought for a moment. "Now," he said, "we build a world that doesn't need men like me to protect it." She nodded, resting her head against his shoulder. "Then let's start tomorrow." And for once, there was no gunfire, no fear. No unfinished business, just the sound of waves hitting the rocks below, and the heartbeat of a home finally at peace. Because love had done what power never could. It ended the war. The world had a strange way of forgetting and forgiving at the same time. 5 years after Daniel Moretti walked out of prison, the city that once whispered his name like a curse now spoke it like a warning and a prayer. Some people called him a legend. Others called him the last man who tried to make the system bleed and somehow survived it. He never corrected any of them. He didn't need to. The truth had already taken its place, quiet, unglamorous, steady, as the life he'd built with Grace and Ethan began to settle into something resembling peace. Their home was smaller now. They'd sold the Sea House after the media frenzy died down, moved inland to a modest farmhouse surrounded by fields instead of guards. The air was cleaner there, the nights darker, the silence real. Daniel spent his mornings fixing things that didn't need fixing: fences, hinges, the porch light, and his afternoons teaching Ethan how to drive along the back roads, laughing every time the boy stalled the engine. Grace watched them from the kitchen window, coffee in hand, a smile that never got old curling across her lips. But peace, even the good kind, came with ghosts. There were nights when Daniel still woke gasping, hands reaching for a gun that wasn't there, the old instincts snapping to life before he remembered where he was. Grace would roll over, place a hand on his chest and whisper, You're home. Two words that always brought him back. Sometimes he believed them. Sometimes he didn't. Ethan was 13 now, tall for his age, still using sign language as his first language, but speaking more too, his voice low and deliberate like his father's. He had Daniel's eyes, Grace's stubbornness, and a curiosity that scared both of them in different ways. One afternoon, he came home from school with a newspaper folded under his arm. On the front page was an article about the city's redevelopment projects, the ones Daniel's foundation had started years ago. They want to rename the downtown park, Ethan said, setting the paper on the counter. After you. Daniel didn't even look up from the paperwork he was sorting. They don't need to do that. Ethan frowned. Why not? You built it. Grace smiled softly. Because your dad doesn't like people remembering the parts of him he's still trying to forget. Daniel glanced up, meeting her eyes. Something like that. But Ethan wasn't satisfied. If people only remembered the bad stuff, he said, then what's the point of doing good? Daniel froze. The question landed harder than it should have. He closed the folder in front of him and leaned back in his chair. The point, he said slowly, is to do it anyway. Grace reached across the table and touched Ethan's wrist. Your dad's right. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't change how people see you. It just changes you. Ethan nodded, thoughtful, but Daniel could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. The boy was too smart for his own good, too aware of the weight his last name carried. It scared him sometimes, the thought that legacy could be inherited like blood. He wanted Ethan to have a different kind of inheritance, one made of choices, not consequences. That night, after Ethan went to bed, Grace found Daniel on the porch, staring out at the stars. You're thinking too loud, she said, sitting beside him. He chuckled softly. That obvious? You always get that look when you're fighting something you can't shoot. He smiled at that, but it didn't reach his eyes. He asked me today why I don't want things named after me. I didn't know how to tell him the truth. Which is? That if people start turning me into a story, they'll forget the damage I did before I tried to fix it. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. Maybe that's not for you to decide anymore. Maybe the story isn't about what you broke. It's about what you built after. He turned to her. And what about you? Don't you ever wish you'd picked a quieter life? She laughed softly. Daniel, I was a waitress with 3 maxed-out credit cards and a leaky apartment ceiling when I met you. I think the universe owed me a little chaos. He grinned, the first real one she'd seen all day. You call this chaos? I call this peace with an attitude, she said, and he laughed until the sound melted into the night. A week later, an invitation arrived. The city council was hosting a charity gala to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Sophia project. Grace's foundation had grown into a cornerstone of the city's recovery. Schools, shelters, vocational programs. They wanted her to speak, to honor her work and Daniel's vision. Grace hesitated, but Daniel encouraged her. You built that, he said. You should stand in front of it. And what about you? She asked. I'll be in the back, he said. That's where I belong. The night of the gala, Grace wore a simple black dress, her hair pinned back, her calm masking the storm underneath. Daniel drove them to the event, hand steady on the wheel, Ethan in the back seat, eyes wide at the lights of the city he barely remembered. The hotel ballroom was a glittering thing, crystal chandeliers, white linen, the smell of money trying to look benevolent. As they entered, whispers followed like a tide. Some faces smiled, others didn't. When Grace stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. 10 years ago, she began, this city was drowning in fear. I don't need to remind anyone why, but what we sometimes forget is that fear doesn't disappear when the shooting stops. It lingers, in silence, in mistrust, in empty playgrounds and boarded-up homes. The Sophia Project was built to fight that silence, to give voices back to people who'd been told they didn't matter. My husband believed power could be rebuilt into something human again. He wasn't wrong. Her voice wavered only once when she looked toward Daniel. We are all the sum of what we survive, but survival is just the beginning. The rest, the building, the forgiving, the choosing to stay. That's the real work. That's what makes us whole. The applause that followed was slow at first, then thunderous. Grace smiled, blinking back tears. When she stepped down, Daniel met her halfway. You were perfect, he said softly. Remind me to breathe next time, she whispered, and he kissed her forehead, uncaring of the cameras. But peace never stayed unchallenged. Later that night, after the speeches and the photographs, a man approached them near the exit. Older, suit too sharp, smile too polished. Daniel recognized him instantly. Anthony Vance, the brother of the prosecutor who had once tried to bury him. Mr. Moretti, Vance said smoothly, extending a hand. It's been a long time. Daniel didn't take it. Not long enough. Grace stepped slightly forward, protective in her own quiet way. Can we help you, Mr. Vance? Vance's smile tightened. I just came to offer congratulations. 10 years of public service. It's quite the transformation. Though I imagine some people might still wonder how much of that foundation money came from the ashes of Marlowe's accounts. Grace stiffened. Every cent is clean. I'm sure it is, Vance said, eyes flicking between them. Still, old ghosts die hard. People love redemption stories until they start looking too perfect. Daniel leaned in, his voice low and deadly calm. If you're trying to provoke me, you'll have to do better than recycled rumors. Vance chuckled. No provocation, just a reminder that power, even the kind that calls itself good, always attracts a storm. He walked away before either of them could answer. Grace exhaled shakily. Do you think he's looking for a headline? Daniel said. Nothing more, but I'll keep an eye open. She wanted to believe him, but the old unease returned. That night, as they drove home, she caught Daniel glancing at the rearview mirror too often, his hand tightening on the wheel every time headlights appeared behind them. The ghosts, it seemed, were never really gone. The following days unfolded with a strange quiet that felt too controlled to be safe. Daniel's instincts, honed over decades of surviving men like Marlowe, told him that silence was never mercy. It was calculation. He had learned to read danger not in the noise it made, but in the stillness it left behind. He didn't tell Grace that he'd begun checking his phone at midnight again, scrolling through encrypted messages from old contacts who owed him favors. He didn't tell her that 2 of his foundation's accounts had been frozen for review, or that a subpoena had been issued under Anthony Vance's signature. He only told her the truth when it could no longer be avoided. It was a Sunday morning, the kind of morning that smelled like pancakes and laughter. Ethan was in the yard kicking a soccer ball. Grace was reading at the kitchen table when Daniel walked in holding a manila envelope. They reopened the investigation, he said quietly. She looked up, eyes narrowing. On what grounds? The same as before, he said, dropping the envelope onto the table. They're calling it a forensic audit of the Sophia Project. Vance wants to prove the foundation was built on dirty money. That's ridiculous, Grace said. Everything's documented, transparent. He doesn't care about truth, Daniel said. He wants a spectacle, and he wants me back in handcuffs before the next election cycle. Grace stood, crossing her arms. So what do we do? We fight, Daniel said. But not the way I used to. No lawyers in shadows, no blackmail. Just the truth. He opened the envelope, revealing a thick stack of documents. They're trying to twist every donation, every contract, every dollar. I'll testify again, this time publicly. No more backrooms, no more whispers. Grace studied him, her heart aching at the determination in his face. "You're sure?" "If I hide again, they win," he said. "And if I go down, I want it to be for something honest." The hearings began a month later. The courtroom was smaller this time, but the stakes felt bigger. Anthony Vance sat across from Daniel, his smirk perfectly composed for the cameras. Grace testified first, her calm voice filling the room as she detailed every project, every audit, every act of transparency. Vance tried to corner her to imply complicity, but Grace had learned from the first trial. She didn't flinch. She didn't stutter. "If you're looking for corruption, Mr. Vance," she said coolly, "you should start with the people who benefit from pretending it still exists." Then it was Daniel's turn. Vance circled him like a predator playing with its food. "Mr. Moretti," he began, "you claim to have left your criminal life behind. Yet here you are, under investigation again. Doesn't that suggest the system still sees you as the man you used to be?" Daniel met his gaze. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it means the system doesn't like it when someone plays by its rules better than it does." A murmur rippled through the room. Vance's smile tightened. "So you admit to manipulating the system?" "No," Daniel said evenly. "I'm saying I learned it. From people like you." Grace watched from the gallery, her chest swelling with pride and fear. The press painted it as a battle between redemption and revenge. By the third day, Moretti trial was trending nationwide. The Sophia Project's website crashed under the flood of donations and messages of support. But as public sympathy grew, so did the threats. Anonymous calls, broken windows, men parked outside their house who never stepped out of their cars. The breaking point came on the final day of testimony. Daniel left the courthouse to find his car tires slashed and a note tucked under the windshield wiper. "You should have stayed in the shadows." That night Grace found him sitting on the porch, gun in hand, staring at the horizon. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't go back there." "They're threatening you," he said. "They're threatening Ethan." "Then we show them we're not afraid," she said. "You once told me fear is currency. Stop spending it." He looked at her for a long time, then placed the gun on the table beside him. "You're stronger than I am," he said quietly. "No," she whispered, sitting beside him. "You just taught me how to fight without losing my soul." The verdict came 2 weeks later. The judge cleared them of all charges. The court ruled that the Sophia Project was lawful, ethical, and beyond reproach. The decision was unanimous. The city erupted in applause. For the first time in 20 years, Daniel Moretti's name wasn't followed by scandal. It was followed by silence. Peaceful, unprofitable silence. But the cost of that peace lingered in small ways. Daniel stopped giving interviews. He declined public appearances. Instead, he focused on mentorship, teaching young community leaders how to build without corruption, how to negotiate without blood. Grace expanded her foundation internationally, traveling to communities where her story, their story, had become a symbol of transformation. And Ethan, now 16, began to speak at his mother's events, signing and speaking simultaneously, bridging worlds like he'd been born to do. It was during one of those trips, a conference in New York, that Ethan asked a question Daniel hadn't been ready for. They were walking through Central Park, the city glowing behind them. "Dad," Ethan said, "were you ever scared you couldn't change?" Daniel thought for a long time before answering. "Every day," he said. "Change isn't one decision, kid. It's 1,000 small ones you make even when no one's watching." "And what if you mess up?" Ethan asked. "Then you start over," Daniel said. "As long as you keep trying, you haven't failed." Grace joined them, slipping her arm through Daniel's. "He gets that from you," she said softly. "No," Daniel said. "He gets that from us." That night, Daniel sat by the hotel window watching the city lights flicker like old ghosts finally fading. Grace came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "You ever think about how far we've come?" she murmured. "Every day," he said. "And it still doesn't feel real." "Maybe it's not supposed to," she said. "Maybe it's just supposed to feel worth it." He turned, kissing her hand. "You still make it feel that way." They went home the next day, back to the quiet rhythms they'd earned. Spring came early that year, bringing wildflowers along the fence line and laughter through the open windows. Grace's foundation launched a scholarship in Daniel's name. He pretended to hate it, but secretly framed the certificate in his office. Ethan got accepted to college, studying political science and ethics, saying he wanted to fix the system from the inside. Daniel teased him about choosing the one career that paid less than crime, and Ethan rolled his eyes, saying, "You're living proof that honesty's more profitable in the long run." One evening, they sat together on the porch, the sky painted gold. Grace leaned against Daniel's shoulder, Ethan's music drifting softly through the house. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly. "The chaos?" He smiled faintly. "Sometimes, but only because it reminded me what peace feels like." She traced circles on his hand. "You know, I think that's what this was all for." "What?" "Learning to want quiet more than control." He nodded, looking out at the horizon. "You were always better at the endings than me." "Maybe," she said. "But you're getting there." As the sun dipped below the hills, Daniel realized something he hadn't in years. The absence of fear didn't feel like emptiness anymore. It felt like space. Space to breathe, to build, to live. The man who once ruled a city through silence had finally learned to exist without the need to be heard. Later that night, Ethan found an old photograph in a drawer. His parents younger, standing in front of a diner under a flickering neon sign. He showed it to them at the kitchen table. "Was this the night you met?" he asked. Grace smiled. "Close enough?" Daniel laughed quietly. "That's where everything started, and where everything almost ended." "Do you regret it?" Ethan asked. Daniel looked at Grace, then at his son. "Not 1 second," he said. "Every scar brought me here." When the boy went to bed, Grace turned to him. "You really mean that?" "More than anything," he said. "Because for the first time, I can look at my life and not see the blood, just the hands that cleaned it." Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady. Grace stood by the window watching it streak down the glass. "Funny how it always comes back to rain," she murmured. "Maybe it's just the world washing itself clean," Daniel said, joining her. They stood there together, the sound of rain mingling with Ethan's quiet laughter from the other room. And for the first time in decades, Daniel Moretti didn't feel like a man escaping his past. He felt like a man who had finally arrived at his future. There comes a moment in every life when the past stops chasing you and starts teaching you. For Daniel Moretti and Grace Miller, that moment didn't come through victory or wealth. It came through loss, forgiveness, and the courage to rebuild when everything was broken. Their story began in fear, grew through chaos, and ended in peace. Not because the world suddenly became kind, but because they learned how to make kindness louder than pain. Daniel spent years trying to control life with power, believing protection meant dominance. But when Grace walked into his world, a woman who'd lost everything yet still believed in goodness, he learned the hardest truth of all. You can't build peace with fear, and you can't love while trying to control what you fear losing. Grace didn't save him with words. She saved him with endurance. Her love wasn't blind. It was brave. It demanded that he confront who he was, not hide from it. Through her, Daniel discovered that redemption isn't about undoing the past. It's about creating a future that proves you've changed. The lesson from their journey is simple, but profound. No matter how dark your story feels, no one is beyond the reach of light if they choose to walk toward it. You can't erase your mistakes, but you can decide what they mean. You can turn guilt into growth, fear into strength, and silence into something that heals. Daniel once believed power made him untouchable. Now he knows love makes him unbreakable. Grace once believed survival was enough. Now she knows living means daring to love again, even when the world gives you every reason not to. So if you're watching this, and you've ever felt like your life is too far gone, too complicated, too stained to start over, remember this: even broken stories can end beautifully. Sometimes, the people who seem the most lost are just waiting for someone to remind them they're worth finding. Tell me what this story made you feel. Have you ever faced a moment when you had to choose between holding on and letting go? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one of them. And if you believe, like Grace and Daniel did, that love can rebuild even the most shattered life, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story that reminds us what it means to be human. Because in the end, it's not the darkness that defines us. It's how we learn to shine through it.